We're moving into the second half of this chapter on kinship and domestic life. And I hope you watch or will watch soon the videos that I put up for you, especially the strange relations one, because it's a very interesting insight into a completely different social construction of marriage. So let's look at household and domestic life. The first aspect of this is family and what is family. Um, and so a very common definition of family in the social sciences is a group of people who, and this is a key point with modern family definition, which this is, a group of people who consider themselves related through kinship. And in North America, that means both close and distant relatives, but it doesn't in all cultures mean that. It's highly culturally constructed what the concepts of family is and who family is and isn't. So all family members don't necessarily live together, but they still have very strong bonds and are still family in our North American social construction of reality. I mean, of reality of family. So, what's a household? Because a household differs from a family. A household is a group of persons or one person living alone. So, one or more persons who occupy a shared living space and who may or may not be related by kinship. So, the definition of family is you're related by kinship in however kinship is defined in your culture. But a household is a group of people living together, and they may or may not be related as kin. So when you look at the forms that households take uh, cross culturally, there's basically three forms. There's the nuclear family, which we're very familiar with, and that's our family structure in North America and Western Europe, pretty much. The extended family, we'll go through each one of these and explain what they are, and then STEM families, which you're probably not familiar with, and it's more common in Asian cultures. So a nuclear family, it's also, or a nuclear household, also called the nuclear family, contains one adult couple, married or partners, with or without children. So it's a very small unit, which is why it's referred to as a nuclear household or nuclear family. An extended household, also extended family, contains more than one adult married couple. And those people may be related through either patrilineal or matrilineal lines, um, depending once again if whether the culture's matrilineal or patrilineal. It can be what's called collateral lines, a collateral household, which is uh, through brothers or through sisters, and polygynous, multiple wives, or polyandrous, multiple husbands, as you have seen in the Strange Relations film from Tibet. So the kind of broad generalizations that one can make about the cross-cultural distribution of the different types of households is that although nuclear households and families, as we have in America generally, are found in all cultures, but this will be interesting to you because we think of that as kind of the default setting for families, I think. They're only found in about a quarter of the world's population. So you can find scatterings of them in cultures all around the world. But the total, groups of people who have a nuclear family household are only about a quarter of the whole world's population. And extended households are the most important form and the most there are more of them than any other kind in cultures around the world. Now, the distribution of both nuclear and extended households follows that mode of production again that we've been looking at the last couple of chapters, and how it affects reproduction and numbers of children people have and a variety of other things. So does the type of family you live in follow those modes of production. And so nuclear families are found in, at the extremes of that continuum. Remember the continuum from foraging to industrial digital, and in between were the horticultural, pastoral, and agricultural people. So where you find nuclear families are in those extreme ends, foraging cultures or cultures like ours, industrial, digital cultures. And that reflects the need in those cultures for mobility. You got to move quickly to get around. Your job may be 3,000 miles, your new job might be 3,000 miles away. You got to move your family. Well, it's a heck of a lot easier to move a wife or husband and a kid or two than to move the whole family, as my ex-husband used to call them, to aunts and uncles and grandparents and all of that. And that's the same in foraging societies because they're moving around, foraging a lot. And then, and so you need both spatial mobility and flexibility in a variety of other ways in those two cultures. Now, extended families are found in those middle modes of production, horticultural, pastoral, and agricultural, because they're pretty much, other than the pastoralists, they move around, but in a very different way. They have, tents and yurts and pack animals, and it's a big process. And so they move around with a lot of people and a lot of stuff, unlike foragers. And then the horticulturalists and the agriculturalists are stable. They don't move that much. They live in villages and towns and that type of thing. So they have extended households because they don't need to have quick spatial mobility the way those other two types do. And then in Japan and East Asia, there's this other type of household called the STEM household. That's a co-residential, so more than one group, co-residential group that is comprised of only two married couples that are related through the male line, and generally only one son remains in the household, usually the eldest son. So that STEM household, it contains the older parents and the eldest son and and his family. So his wife and children, the eldest sons, and the son's wife is basically the caretaker of her husband's parents, and they all live in the same house. But that, although it's a very ancient way of living in East Asia and Japan, and I might add China, it's an increasingly difficult one to maintain because modern children in those cultures, adult children, don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to be, I guess the way Westerners would think of it, is stuck taking care of their elderly parents and living with them. They have other ambitions that have to do with, work, employment, professional, and moving, and being able, once again, that flexibility in a smaller group to be able to move for a job and that type of thing. And then, of course, the aging parents whose children don't want to take care of them start applying pressure on them to live with them and move in with them. So this is kind of a new dynamic, a modern dynamic in those cultures that have traditionally had the eldest son and his wife live with the son's parents. So who's the head of the household? Now, you're familiar with this terminology from doing taxes, probably. That's where we come across it the most in our culture. So that is the person who, is most, the way it's thought of, who runs the show, basically, who's most responsible for things, has the most authority, et cetera, et cetera. And that concept exists everywhere. It's just that we tend to think of it most, or see that terminology most, when we do our taxes. But every culture has an idea of who's kind of the head of the family, who manages things. So that's the primary person or persons, the head of the household, who's responsible for supporting the household financially and making major decisions. And this idea is, although it exists in all cultures, it doesn't manifest or exist in the way that we think of this kind of Euro-American view that emphasizes income distribution. That's kind of how we define it. Who makes the most money, who pays the bills the most, that type of thing. So it's based on that. In Western cultures, that's been traditionally the male. I mean, there were, generations of women who did not work outside of the home for the most part. So they weren't, although they were contributing financially to the household through their labor, that was not valued and not monetized in any way. And it certainly didn't, quote, pay the bills. So the model of a male household head um, is was spread by European colonialism across the world. And what the unfortunate thing about that is it was superimposed on cultures that didn't already have that concept. So now, the model of a male household head is the way statistics are gathered. Official statistics, for instance, are gathered worldwide based on that. Which means that if there's a resident male and female in a household, the assumption is that the man is the head of the household, and they're reported as such when the census and a variety of other things when research and statistics are being done. Their example the text gives you is Brazil considers only the husband to be the head of the household, regardless of whether he contributes or not financially. So the wife could be working full time and the husband could be out of work, and she's supporting the whole family, but he's going to be formally identified as the head of the household. And even in Brazil, even single, separated, or widowed women are deprived of the title of head of household. Even so, when there's no male present in a household in Brazil, the woman is still not called or considered legally the head of the household. So, what is matrifocality? I've mentioned before that the term matriarchal is not a truly accurate term because that suffix archi refers to power. And I've said this before, and the prefix that comes first tells you who has the power. So in a patriarchy, it's the father. Patria is the Latin root for father. Matri is the Latin root for mother. So we talk about in anthropology, sociology, we talk about matrilineal, talking about lineage, and matrifocality, a matrifocal system where the women are the head of the household or in charge. And that's a household pattern in which a female or females is the central figure around whom the other members cluster. I refer you back to the Navajo again because it's the largest example that we have in North America today they're the largest tribe that practices matrifocality. Men can still be part of the household, certainly. It's not necessarily like the Mosu that some of you are reading about in Leaving Mother Lake, where the men don't even live with the women and children, et cetera, et cetera. In most matrifocal cultures, that's not true, and matrilineal cultures, the men do live with the families. It's just that the property belongs to the, grandma, to the eldest female, basically, and gets passed down to her daughters. And that's how the line works. And that gives her an enormous amount of authority in the whole system. So the number of women-headed households, as you might imagine, I'm sure you're aware of this in America, the great increase in woman-headed households. And that's increasing worldwide, that phenomenon. And of course, they tend to be poorer than male-headed households because around the world, men make more money. And also, a female head of household usually, not always, but usually means she's the only head of household, that she's a single mom or whatever the situation is, she's supporting the family solely. And so not only is it one income, it's a lower single income. So in healthy functioning, I'm so glad they put this in your text. In healthy functioning households, gender doesn't matter about who's the head of the household. It's the resources and how they're shared that makes the difference. Okay, the next section we're looking at is what's called intra-household dynamics. What happens within the household, the connections between the people within those households. So the first we're going to look at is the spouse partner relationships. And the landmark study done in Tokyo in 1959, that may sound like a very long time ago to you. I guess it was a long time ago. But they have replicated this research over the years. That was the original research. And what this showed was that they compared the marital satisfaction of husbands and wives in love marriages versus arranged marriages. And this is interesting because in both types of marriages, of course, marital satisfaction declined over time. That's true everywhere. In virtually, well, I mean, not in 100% of marriages, but in the vast majority of marriages, that's true. Cross-culturally, around the world, whatever. So, but in this study, the decline was the greatest for wives in arranged marriages and the least for husbands in arranged marriages. Now, isn't that an interesting factoid? I think it is. Think about this. The marital satisfaction was the least for the women in arranged marriages, but the most satisfaction were the men in the husbands in arranged marriages. Now, in the love match, comparing with arranged marriages, both partners' satisfaction dropped dramatically. Earlier for the wives, a little bit later for the husbands, because I'm sure you've heard of this terminology, the honeymoon effect, which is basically pheromones. It's basically biology, and incredible passion and romance and all of that. The maximum amount of time that lasts is about a year. Sometimes it's 6 months to a year, which is why I always tell students you better have more than that to base a long-term relationship on, or a partnership that's going to include children. Because once that decreases, which it does over time dramatically, then you better have a solid basis at something other than sexual attraction and passion and romance, because that's going to wane. Sooner for others, longer for others, but it does eventually wane. So in the love match, both of their partner satisfaction dropped dramatically, earlier for wives, later for husbands, and that's because the honeymoon effect doesn't last long, much past the first year of marriage. So think about now, cross-culturally, what's the proper role for wives or the proper role for husbands? I think we pretty much know what our own is, although that's changing, dramatically, and has changed dramatically over the years. But for example, in Japan, a good wife still in modern day should care for husband's needs and keep household issues private. So basically, you take care of the house, you take care of the husband. If there's any problems, you do not go to a marriage counselor or a therapist. You certainly don't hang out with your girlfriends and talk about it in Japan. It's very, very kept very close. So many of the men in Japan are what are called salary men. They're corporate workers. They work in huge corporations in Japan. And they go out after work and drink copious amounts of alcohol, and then they come home late and drunk, and it is the wife's job to be sure he gets dinner and gets put to bed and gets up in the morning and all of that. And as your book points out, in our terminology, that would be codependent. Wait, you have an alcoholic husband. He comes home every night drunk. You got to get him fed, put him to bed, be sure he gets up in the morning. Aren't you aiding and abetting his alcoholism? But that, and from an American perspective, the answer would be yes, that's a codependent relationship. But in Japan, that's what's expected. And I have to add something here. I, years ago, worked for a Japanese firm in Seattle, and this is all true. And part of the reason I wound up leaving that job is that I was expected to be there hours and hours and hours in terms of going out to um, dinner with everybody after work, and they had baseball games on the weekends. And you're in Japan, your job is your family. It's your primary family. It's the primary people you hang with. And the rest is periphery. Well, that doesn't work for me, as you might imagine. I had a couple of children and a husband, and that wasn't going to happen. But I did observe that. And another interesting thing, just as an aside, about the Japanese family dynamic is those wives are the ones who manage the money. Uh, the CEO of our corporation just handed his check over to his wife, every month or whenever it came. And he just used a credit card. She paid all the credit card bills. She paid all the bills for the house, and doled him out a bit of cash every week or month so that he had some cash on him. So I thought that was so interesting at that time. So what about sibling relationships? Well, they're not studied enough, as your book points out. They're understudied, but they're extremely important. So if you look at that Arab sibling study in your text, you wouldn't want to be in that culture as a sister. Probably wouldn't want to be a female child, pretty much. But what happened with that sister that they described in the study is her brother was basically abusive, verbally, very controlling of her movements, always wondering where she was going, what she was doing, and you don't go out much anyway in that culture. And as I said, verbally abusive. Well, that's a very common phenomenon of a relationship between a brother and a sister in Arab cultures. And what it does is it's a socializing process for the female, for the female sibling, for the daughter, or the sister, excuse me, that maintains it. It's a process that maintains and perpetuates male domination in the household. That's how she grew up with her brothers, and that's how it's going to be with her husband. So that's an interesting. Now, there's been sibling studies, of course, done in Western cultures and in the US. Some of you probably have siblings. Sometimes those are great relationships. Often they're not, and they're often very fraught. Um, and it depends. There's a lot of research on the length of time between siblings. I think what I've observed and read about, and from my own life too, the longer amount of time there is, the less sibling rivalry there is, because that young one gets everything it needs up until, in terms of attachment and bonding and all of that and attention, up until it's more independent. So that's an interesting thing to think about. This is a kind of a sad thing to talk about, this next subject, which is domestic violence between partners. The U.S. has the highest rate of domestic violence of any industrialized nation. Any nation where it's not kind of an accepted part of the culture, which it is in some cultures, the Arab culture we just talked about. But in terms of Western cultures, we have the highest rate of domestic violence. And as you may be aware, it's increasing dramatically through COVID with the stresses that people are having, economic and isolation and a variety of other things. So You probably know this as well from other classes or just general knowledge that males are the vast majority of perpetrators of domestic violence. And that's true in all cultures. It does vary in form and frequency in different cultures, but it's true in all cultures that males, we're talking anywhere from 90 to 99% of domestic violence is male perpetrated. So, wife beating and abuse is much more common in cultures where men control the wealth. So, you think about some of those cultures where women have no money of their own, no a valued contribution other than as producers of children and cookers of food in the family. In those cultures, male violence is much more prevalent. It's less common and less severe where women's work groups and social networks exist. This is where you get into matrifocal and matrilineal cultures. And in those cultures, domestic violence is the lowest among all forms of culture in matrilineal and matrifocal cultures. And because in those cultures, women are important, and we talked about this, I think, either last lecture or the one before, they're important because they're integrally involved in the production of the things that people need to survive: food, clothing, or they go to market and take their goods to market, and so they're major contributors to the economic stability and wealth of the family. And also in those cultures, there's usually a matrifocal residence pattern. So where brides go to live in the mother's household, and that helps in terms of domestic violence too, in terms of reducing domestic violence from males. So there has been increased domestic violence worldwide in the last decade or so. And there's a current one happening, as we've talked about, due to COVID in the U.S. and some other cultures. So the question you have to ask oneself, and it's a sad and disturbing question to ask, but your book posits it, and I think it's worth hearing: is home a safe place? Home has been constructed as, a man's home is his castle. You notice that's a man's home. And a variety of other things where that's where safety and love and bonding and security exist. Well, that's true in many cases, but it's also not true in many cases where home is anything but a safe place, particularly for women and children, and unfortunately domestic animals. That kind of abuse all seems to go together. So once again, this is this part in your text, so I'm going to repeat it. The U.S. has the highest domestic violence rates of all industrialized nations. We have the U.S. We have the highest risk and increasing rates of intra-household abuse of children, including sexual abuse. And we have the highest rates of violence between partners and the abuse of aged family members. Now, it's interesting also, that's the macro picture worldwide. Then you can look at states in the United States, and then you can look at counties within states. So in Oregon, for many, 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 many years, Coos County has been one of the highest of the, maybe the top, always in the top 5 counties, usually, for domestic violence, and that includes the sexual abuse of children and violence against women and a variety of other things, along with alcoholism and drug addiction and that type of thing. I mean, years ago, I wrote the first Head Start grant for Coos and Curry County and had to do research, and I was just blown away, to use a dated terminology, at the rates of, I think at that point we were number 2 in the state. I don't know what we are now, but I know I check every few years because of, the lectures that I'm doing and things, and we're always, as I said, among the highest. So that, and then you look at the kind of economics situation here and the levels of education and a variety of other things, and then you can begin to see those connections that happen, and socialization as well. So let's look at changing kinship and household dynamics. So there's been some changes in descent in recent years, or how descent is constructed and thought of. And because of Western globalization and also colonialization, it contributed, as you might imagine, to a decline in matrilineal kinship because it just didn't compute with Western ideas or values that lineage could be traced through the female line, that property was inherited through the female line. And so they came with their assumptions, the colonists, including in America, um, that males were always the heads of the household, and that's how descent was determined, through the male line or bilineally through both. And so that completely got imposed on the cultures that were being colonized. There was just this assumption that in registering land and property, it was assumed that the male heads even were the heads of household, even where they were really female within the culture. And then Western missionaries, as you might imagine, further contributed to that change of killing off matrilineal cultures and turning them into patrilineal systems. And the example, and it's so true, and I'm so glad that they did it close to home, that your text gives you, is Native American cultures in America were matrilineal. And before colonization, America had one of the largest distributions of matrilineal descent worldwide. If any of you are of Native American descent, and I'm sure some of you are, it's interesting to explore, or you may already know what your tribal culture's descent looked like. The East Coast, the Navajo, and the West Coast. The West Coast was matrilineal from Southeast Alaska all the way down, certainly to the Columbia, and actually a little bit lower than that. So now there have been changes also in how people marry and how they think about marriage and appropriate marriage partners. So in many cultures where arranged marriages have historically been the norm, that's changing and decreasing a bit. They're talking about Nepal here as an example, where elopement has increased since the 1990s. And that's very frowned upon, and yet it's becoming more and more common. And nearly everywhere, the age at first marriage is rising. In other words, people are getting married at an older age than they used to. And that's primarily due to the increased years of education that's necessary to, make a good living and have a professional wage and lifestyle, because higher marital aspirations are linked to economics, like owning a house, for example, things of that nature. And it's very hard to do without higher education at this time in history. The reason for June weddings had to do with farming. I'm sure you know this in America, with farming cultures. And, people used to, and look at June graduation. School always got out in June so kids could work on the farm. And then as soon as you graduated from high school, and that was in June, then you got married. That was historically the American model. So now the other thing that's changing about marriage is that there's an increasing marriage between different ethnicities. And that's partly due to international migration, as people meet people from other countries and come into contact with them, for instance. There's also a phenomenon happening, you may have heard of this, called the marriage crisis. And that is a cultural situation in which many people who want to marry can't find partners for, various reasons. This happened after World War One. So such a large percentage of young men in particularly Britain, but France as well, and some other European nations, but I've read about it mostly relating to England. So many were killed that there just weren't husbands for, there weren't enough men to go around for the women of that generation, young women of that generation. So there were many, many, many uh, unmarried women in England after the First World War. That's an example of a marriage crisis. But now it's increasingly frequent again, and not necessarily at all because of wars, but because of economics is a huge one. They talk about in Africa where men simply cannot get together the bride price or whatever is necessary for those exchanges we talked about that need to be made between parents of prospective marriage partners. So there's that, and the marriage age. What happens then is that uh, if women don't marry in many cultures and they, get past a certain age, then their reputations just are get blown. They're considered immoral, and the biggest part is there's no social role from them because in many traditional cultures, non-Western cultures, the only role for a female is to be married and bear children. In China, we read about the one child policy and all that. In China, in 2020, there were 2 million men who won't be able to find women to marry because of that one child policy and the preference for sons. And this is, I think I mentioned this before, this is kind of a duh. If you do that, it's amazing that people as bright as the Chinese couldn't foresee this coming, that there would be a shortage of female children, but there were. So now there's 2 million men who are not going to be able to marry or find husbands. Weddings have kind of morphed and changed too. There's been a kind of a globalization of the what's called the Western white wedding. White was never worn for weddings until Queen Victoria. She was the first uh, d- to wear white when she got married in 1860 something, I think. And it was, oh my God, it was a scandal. Everybody went big brouhaha about wearing white. But that became the tradition and became very fashionable. And that's spreading around the world, but there's some places where you just wouldn't wear white, for instance, India, at your wedding because white is mourning, as it is in several cultures. What else is changing is households. So households are changing a lot around the world in the modern era. We see that in our own country, don't we? We have all different kinds of households and and gender identities related with households and families today that we didn't used to have. So there's an assumption, and it seems to be true, that the extended family households will decline as industrialization and urbanization and globalization of Western culture, and because of all of those things, the frequency of nuclear families are going to increase and extended families decrease. Now, I've seen other research that says actually, even in the West, and particularly the United States, extended families may actually wind up increasing a bit due to economics, because the more people in a household, uh, the more income can be generated. So, you can rent a house and have three different people pay for the rent or buy it as opposed to, one person. So you get the point. But in general, it's going the opposite direction because everything's modernizing and globalizing, and our form is the nuclear family. So international migration is another cause, and as they point out, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, that there can be a huge drop in fertility and numbers of children that a family would normally have if they stayed in their country of origin. But when they come to another country, particularly a Western country, they're leaving a farming household, remember the modes of production, where you need a bunch of children, and you're moving to an industrialized nation where children are not financially contributors, but they cost a lot of money, and you don't need them to work on a farm. And so that's another cause for families shrinking. In the US, there are three kinds of households that are the most common in the 21st centuries. And that is households composed of couples living in their first marriage. And then there's single parent households and households formed through remarriage, which is extremely common, as I'm sure you know. And there's increasingly this fourth kind that I was just talking about, which is an extended type of family that's multi-generational households, where an adult child comes back and lives with the family. That is a large wave of change in American families. And it has to do, once again, with economics and the need for more education. So it's very hard to pay for college and support live on your own and all that type of thing. So there's this movement of adult children back home. There are other reasons, of course, that happens, but basically it's economics, and whether that includes education or not, increasingly that also includes that. So the number of adult children moving home with parents rose dramatically during the Great Recession in 2008 and onward. And now 16% of the population in America lives in homes with multiple generations. So you can see what I was saying about the increased extended family. The other thing that's happened in the US and everywhere pretty much is that the marriage age for young adults has risen in the US, and they're most likely to live at home and stay at home until they marry now, once again, due to economics. There's also a fifth category, which is increasing dramatically, which is women having children at much later ages. That's another thing that's happening, is that the age of having your first child has increased a lot, and so that's called late forming families. Women marrying much later, and men, and then having their first child much later than they used to. Okay, that's that chapter, and I will see you next week.